All right. Hi, gang. I apologize for not being able to be in class with you today in person. However, I'd like to go ahead and get us started talking about Native cultures, Native American cultures in the Arctic. So we left off on Thursday talking about the European invasions, and we focused mainly on the East Coast, discussing the Spanish and the French, as well as the English, the Dutch, and the Swedish, um, and the push toward the West. And we left with looking at Russia's contact with mainly the Aleutian Islanders and eventually into mainland Alaska and down the British Columbian coast of Canada as a good segue into the Arctic realms. So let's think about quickly as we're moving over from the old world into the new, some of the first Russian groups to enter and become familiar with America. So, of course, Russia knew of this Alaskan region on the other side of the Bering Strait. And one of the first people who was actually Dutch that the Russians sent over to investigate this areas to their far east borders was a gentleman named Vitrus Bering, who actually traveled all the way across Russia on land, overland, to finally get to the Northeast Asian coast, and then proceeded to sail across the strait and came to the Aleutian Islands, and that is where we get the name the Bering Strait for this gentleman, Vitrus Bering, who actually was suffering from quite a bit of scurvy by the time he finally got to the Aleutian Islands. And what they learned is that once you're on an island, you actually can eat various grasses that are high in vitamin C that are growing in these coastal climates that quite a lot of native groups are quite familiar with. However, a lot of the Russian early explorers coming across the Bering Strait refused to eat grass. It was considered below them and allowed themselves to die of scurvy. So that's a little extra tidbit that I'm sure you didn't need to know. But what was really pulling Russians over to Alaska, over to the New World for the first time, was again the fur trade, similar to the French interests in Northeast North America. So it was otter pelts that was actually driving Russian interest in the New World. And this led to occupation of the Aleutian Islands and other Alaskan islands to have the native groups that they came in contact with provide Russian, you could say colonists, but really merchants with these otter pelts that were the new craze in Russia. And these are sea otters, and they pretty much have driven the sea otter to extinction during this time period. We're looking here at about the mid 1700s when this was going on, okay? And they used this otter pelt trade. It was very lucrative for these merchants, these Russian merchants, for 100 years or more until you finally have English whalers coming up meeting everyone's heard of Captain Cook, right? Meeting some Russian sailors in the North Seas of the Pacific into the Bering Strait in the Bering Sea. So you see Russian and English starting to kind of fight over the waters a couple hundred years after the Russians have made this impression on native Alaskan groups in the Aleutian Islands. And this impression, of course, was not a very good one. So it has led to quite a lot of hostility between the Aleutian native groups and the Russians, and which is going back, historically to their treatment. So that is the contact that you see on the western side of the New World with the Old World. Notice it was later in time, especially since the Russians were really only interested in where they could access these otter pelts, which was along the coast and along the Aleutian Islands. They had very little interest in moving inland and having any to do with any of the other native Alaskan groups that were occupying the interior, as well as occupying the northern sea coasts. Now, you can still see this influence of Russian culture all over Alaska, especially in Western Alaska. And this is an example of a Russian Orthodox church that is built in southeast Alaska. So let's think about what cultural groups we're looking at when we're talking about the Arctic. So, according to your textbook, we're looking at the Yupik, which are actually in the southwest area of the state. Yes. And I'm thinking southwest, southeast, southwest area of the state. But for the most part, we're actually looking at Inupiat groups. The reason Yupik is included is because they're highly related to the Siberian Yupik, which are actually occupying the Arctic. Notice that we're looking at the northern half bordering the North Sea over here in Russia, whereas the Yupik groups actually are occupying the southern half of Alaska over here and is technically not inside the Arctic Circle, so not technically an Arctic group. And we'll look at where we draw the line between the Arctic and the subarctic on the next slide. So we're looking at Inupiat groups, okay, and that is also known as Inuit groups. As you move further along the Canadian coast into Greenland, and these are also the groups that have come to occupy areas further south in the northeast, such as Labrador. Now, remember we talked about language groups as well. And so the native cultures to actually occupy the Arctic are one of the last language groups to have migrated or dispersed into North America. One of the earliest ones, of course, being the Na-Dene language family, which is another word for the Athabascan language family. This is one of the earliest or oldest at least language families to have come over to the New World, which are apparently related linguistically to some Siberian groups as well. Now, the Na-Dene family is occupying mostly subarctic areas, so we'll get to those groups later in the semester. And we're looking very much at language groups that are associated with the Eskimo Aleut family. Of course, the Aleut family is going to predominantly be in the Aleutian Islands, hence the name Aleut. And then Eskimo family is kind of a term for the language groups of the Inupiat. Now, Eskimo, of course, is almost a derogatory term now, referring to native Alaskans or any native culture that occupies the Arctic. Mainly because it's an all-encompassing term. It really doesn't pay homage to the diversity of cultures that we see in this area. Now, here we are looking at language groups on this map, and you can see that we've got the Naukan Yupik and the Central Yupik and the Siberian Yupik kind of going in this north to south east trajectory, and that's why your book refers to the Yupik still as some of the Arctic groups. In addition to that, these groups down here, they're coastal, so they're practicing a lot of the same subsistence methods, economic methods as these more northern groups of the Inupiat. So that's another reason that you can consider them as part of this Arctic cultural characteristic or cultural collection of characteristics, because you do see some similarity in resources, which has an effect on their culture as a whole. So, not in a environmental deterministic kind of way, but in one aspect that's affecting their culture, if we're thinking about Julian Stewart and his influence, okay? And then these cultures within here that are still very prominent in Alaska, like the Ahtna and the Tanana. These are the Athabascan, the Dena'ina here, Na Dene groups that we'll look at later in the semester, especially groups like the Tlingit, who are definitely considered in our subarctic chapter. Notice that they're of the same latitude as the Yupik. So that's interesting. So let's talk about what the Arctic technically is. The Arctic refers to anywhere above the Arctic Circle, which is at 66 degrees latitude. Okay, that is technically the polar desert, as well as what many people refer to as the Arctic desert or desert tundra. That is above the tree line here, that is close to 66 degrees latitude. Now, the subarctic is very, very different, but of course, as you can imagine, with most things that are natural and anthropological, there is definitely a gray area in here where you have some overlap, especially cultural overlap, when you have environmental regulators like the ocean coast, which is pretty much providing a similar environmental or ecological experience to an entire half of the state of Alaska, that spans the Arctic Circle or 66 degrees latitude. So when you think of the Arctic and this polar desert, especially in the frozen North Sea, which is well, melting right now, right? So it's not going to be frozen for too much longer. You are thinking of a snow wilderness, okay? But when you go a little bit further, closer to the actual Arctic Circle, this is where you see the Arctic tundra. Now it is made up of mainly shrub plants, a lot of Ericaceae, and that's your berries, your crowberries, your blueberries, what we call salmon berries, as well as various kinds of cranberries. The landscape is beautiful and has rolling hills, not a lot of deposition, and you're looking at mountains in the distance here, which in northern Alaska would represent the Brooks Range. Now, this is the same kind of environment that you actually also see in alpine areas, alpine tundra. So you need to either increase your latitude to get to this kind of ecosystem or increase your altitude to get to this kind of ecosystem. This, however, is the subarctic, and this is what we know as the boreal forest interior. So notice this is significantly different than the tundra biome. So you're looking at a coniferous forest, very different animals live in this forest, very different resources, and of course this is in the coastal areas called a coastal coniferous forest. So you've got a different kind of vegetation that enjoy more humidity, you could say. And by the time you get down to the northwest coast, which is a whole different culture area, down here in Washington, southern British Columbia, that's actually technically a rainforest. They experience so much weather and precipitation. So let's think about the characteristics of the Arctic. What is the environment that these cultures are living in? The first thing I want you to remember about the Arctic is seasonality. Okay, you're limited as far as seasons, and not only do you have a shifting of seasons every year, which we don't have too much further south towards the equatorial zone, but it's a very dynamic shift between seasons, okay? And this has a direct effect on the biomass of the Arctic. So what resources, what subsistence opportunities are available to these cultural groups, you see? So what low biomass means is that you have a limited number of species that make the Arctic their home, and you also have a limited variety of species. Okay, so whereas when you think of hunters and gatherers, what are they surviving on? You know, walrus is a very popular meal. Some of my Inuit friends and colleagues tell me that one of their favorite things to eat as a traditional food is fermented walrus blubber, which they bury in a hole in the ice and leave for 6 months or so, and then come back, and it's pretty much fermented in its own juices. And apparently, it was fantastic. I've never had it, but I'd try it. And then, of course, we have muskox, which used to be indigenous to the area. Then they died out and actually have recently been reintroduced to the area. Caribou, of course, has been a staple since the late Pleistocene. And you have the polar bear in the polar desert, okay, as well as various other water mammals, coastal mammals, such as the seal, um, some smaller animals, like the snowshoe hare that turn brown in the summer and white in the winter so they can stay hidden. You've got elk and moose, and if this is the pika, one of the few smaller animals in the region. And it really does seem like you have quite a variety of species available to you. And let's not forget, we're talking about coastal peoples if we're talking about the Arctic. And later, about 4,000 years ago, really you start to see this adaptation to whaling, which, when you think about it, takes you out into the open water using harpoons to catch these animals and bring these animals home. Let's also think about what kind of predators you have working against you as a mammal, as a hunter. The Arctic wolf, as well as bears. This you can see is a grizzly bear waving at you. But there's three kinds of bears in Alaska. There's polar bears, there's grizzly bears, and there's black bears. Black bears are more common to the forest. They like to scamper up trees when they're threatened, whereas the grizzly bear is more at home in big wide open spaces like the Arctic tundra, where I guess what makes the grizzly bear have a reputation for being a little bit more aggressive is that they have nowhere to run. They're in the open environment, so they're very territorial, and what you don't want to do is invade their space. Now, the grizzly bear, the brown bear, and the Kodiak bear, those are all the same bear. There's just different names for them. So you've also got the lynx, which is a very unique cat and the only cat species in the Arctic or that far north. And the fox. There are no reptiles in Alaska, so no snakes. There is one amphibian that is an Arctic frog. And during the winter, it buries itself in the ground and literally freezes. And then when it thaws in the spring, the frog itself thaws and comes up out of the ground and goes along its merry way. I've been told that they're fantastic pets because you never need to get a pet sitter. If you leave town, you just toss it in the freezer. So, low biomass. It seems like I've showed you quite a few animals. Let's not forget, there's also avian species. So there are bird resources. There's quite a lot of insects. The Arctic tundra is famous for its mosquito population. You'll also have a variety of spiders and the biggest ants I have ever seen, but I've never been bit by one. However, I have seen more species of mosquito than I ever knew existed. They come in an array of colors. It's kind of fascinating. But this still isn't a large amount of animals. So we're looking at a low variety of species, especially when you compare this to the equatorial zones. I mean, think how many species are available in the rainforest. And within each of these species, you find very little numbers, especially like the bear and the lynx. These are solitary animals. So are the moose. Caribou, however, do move in herds, but we need to think again about seasonality. These animals don't stay in the same place every season. For example, caribou move north to breeding grounds north of the Brooks Range in the Arctic coastal plains during the spring, and then move further south when it gets to be the cold of winter. Low biomass also accounts for plants, and that is why we're still looking at, up until very, very recently, traditional methods of hunting and gathering was the norm for these cultures. So, what are we talking about when we're thinking about plant foods that you can eat? Mostly, we're talking about berries, and berries are available only seasonally, okay? We have some of the best blueberries you'll ever have. These are crowberries. They're kind of flavorless, but you can use them to kind of increase the yield if you're making some kind of blueberry jam or something like that. This is the famous salmonberry. It actually tastes kind of like an apple pie. And then a variety of cranberries. These are blackberries. But they're a staple for these Arctic cultures, and seasonally they will collect so many berries and process these into various forms of food that they can preserve and keep in surplus for the winter. So, a lot of what you're going to read in your textbook is inspired by a set of books called the Handbook of North American Indians. And I wanted to introduce this to you now as you're all starting to prepare your own presentations. So this is a publication put out by the Smithsonian Institution, and the Golden Library owns the entire set of this book, so every volume. If you Google Handbook of North American Indians and find it on Wikipedia, it actually will give you this wonderful table of contents that can allow you to locate your group or locate the region that you need to present on and give you an idea of which volume you need to access in the Golden Library. This is not the only source that I want you to use, but it is a very, very nice introduction to the peoples of that area and can also steer you into the directions of more primary resources that you should be researching for your presentation. And let's not forget final paper in the course. So let's talk about the peoples that we'll be looking at in this chapter. Okay, so the Unangan, which is the southern groups occupying the Aleutian Islands themselves, so way down here in this green area. And then you get into the Yupik, right? So you've got some central Yupik. They're mainly occupying the southwest coastal areas, but do move into the interior. And you start thinking to yourself, well, why are you going to occupy the coast and the interior? And think about seasonality. When are resources going to be available on the coast? And when are resources going to be available in the interior? So you definitely have people using adaptations to both ecological zones. And then, of course, in the north, you have the Inuit cultures. Inuit is what we call the cultures on the northwest side of this literally the Arctic portion of Alaska and Canada. And as you start moving more towards the east, you get into different cultures of the Inupiat family. So the traits that I'm about to go over with you and introduce you to, I want you to remember are overgeneralities, okay? So, in general is how you should preface all of the statements that I'm about to make. But it's an overview of the cultures. Now remember, they are occupying a similar culture area. That's one way that we can combine the Yupik with the Inuit and the Inupiat, is that they are accessing similar resources. And they do actually, of course, have a lot of communication and transmission of their cultural traits, sharing of their cultural traits, if you will, between each group. So the general political organization of tradition of these groups is the band. Okay, so we're looking at a band system, hunter-gatherer groups, one of our smallest type of political units, especially in demographics. The primary social unit is the nuclear family, and kinship varies. There's many groups that strictly practice maternal or paternal descent kinship organization strategies. However, the majority of our Arctic cultural groups use a bilateral kinship system. And that is because resources are sparing in this area, and resources are dictated by the seasons, so you don't always have access to all the resources you need. So therefore, your neighbors really do become resources for you. This is a very strong system of reciprocity that's occurring in the northern areas of the New World. And so, if you have a bilateral kinship system, it provides more resources on either side of your family, on your father's side and your mother's side, as far as being dependent on people to come to your aid in times of need, just like you're expected to do in their times of need. So, these folks are considered hunting, gathering communities, hunters and gatherers, although, of course, right, we've already talked about that there's not an incredible amount to gather. So we're focused on hunting. And the primary staple, of course, especially to groups on the coast during the coastal exploitation season, is sea mammals and fish. In the interior, you're looking at caribou and moose, but you're also looking at bear and rabbit and other available game. And when you think about it, what's very, very interesting, that's baffled researchers for a long time, is if we're focused primarily on hunting and we're not really gathering much in the form of plants, how are these people receiving the nutrition they need to reproduce and make viable populations? Well, it all has to do with the trophic ladder. It's pretty fascinating. So, the amount of mainly sea mammals in the diet of these cultures allows them to attain a certain amount of vitamins and minerals, mainly vitamin C, that the sea mammals are getting from kelp and other types of seaweed that are now being ingested by humans who are eating these sea mammals and providing them with the entire nutrient spectrum that they need. In fact, the Aleutian Islanders are some of the healthiest people on the planet, and they think it's because they have a diet heavy in sea mammals. And they also have the greatest longevity of almost any other culture in the area. So, what kind of technology is common to these Arctic cultural groups? Of course, on the open water, we're talking about harpoon technology. However, if we're looking at sea mammals being acquired closer to the coast or closer to the Arctic shelf, I could say, think about watching a polar bear waiting for a seal to come up through a breathing hole. Well, it wasn't too hard to figure out what a polar bear was doing, and quickly was an adaptation adopted by human groups as well in the past, able to hunt directly from the ice. And that takes similar technologies to what you're using overland if you're doing terrestrial hunting strategies. So you're looking at the lance and the bow and arrow is also very popular. And of course, in recent times, firearms has allowed for modern technology to greatly influence these cultures up in the Arctic. What you see here, of course, is a couple more examples of modern technology being used by these groups. You have, of course, your motorized boat, and for whaling and other subsistence activities. And then, use of modern pulleys and mechanized methods of moving the whale onto the coast. Right. And so this is a fantastic example of a community activity and tradition that is still practiced by almost every Arctic group. And that is the community processing and distribution of the whale. We'll look more at that on Thursday. So, material culture. What type of artifacts were they using, right? What type of shelter did they use? So, when we think about material culture, when we think about their tools and technology, what's the most important technology to people living the Arctic? That's going to be what is allowing everyone to stay warm. And what resources are available to them is, of course, what they can get from their hunting exploits. So, primarily, raw materials consisted of skins, bone, And when I say bone, whalebone, right, makes fantastic structures, structural support, right, for houses and other domiciles. Of course, stone is available to them, and you also often find structures made of wood in a treeless environment. So, where do you think native cultures are acquiring the wood that they need to build these shelters? Since I can't see anybody, I'm sure some of you have guessed or have yelled out by now that a lot of this wood is actually driftwood that is washing up on the coast. All right, so that's very interesting that it actually is a dependable resource for these Arctic peoples. Let's look at a few other houses here, and then let's move down to their vessels. Of course, in the last slide, we saw motorized boats, but very characteristic to Arctic groups, especially Arctic groups that are adapted to coastal subsistence exploits, are their methods of moving around the ocean or moving around the coastal waters. So the umiak you see here, which is a vessel that holds multiple people, and then of course the famous kayak, which holds a single person. Okay, and that's where the same place we get the word for our kayaks that we as use, of course, for more recreation possibilities, but we can hunt from them if we want to. Structures, of course, as I said, are made from skins, as you see here, draped over frames made of wood and bones and even tusk. And let's not forget ice is a constant source of building material, and we know ice structures today as igloos, but they actually make fantastic dwellings and can stay frozen all summer and heated to very comfortable temperatures inside. So if we're talking about now settlement, okay, we've talked about structures. We're looking at small structures. Of course, it's easier to heat small structures. That's our main concern, is staying warm as warm-blooded mammals. So you often have a series of small structures in a settlement area with a single communal structure for men. These structures are what we call semi-subterranean. So they're dug maybe 30, 40 centimeters up to a meter into the ground, right into the earth. Therefore, you have less of a structure that you need to build over these areas, and a hole in the earth insulates heat. So it's another heat conserving strategy, the ability to dig into the earth and dig semi-subterranean foundations for your house. Now, these are permanent settlements. However, during the correct season, groups will relocate to camps in various areas. So they'll move back into a fish camp that they frequent every season, for example. Okay, dress. We've talked about how we're going to protect ourselves from the cold. Okay, so in addition to the structures, what we actually put around our bodies is incredibly important, especially when people were able to develop the technology to start occupying the higher latitudes. So, traditional dress you see in many of these Arctic cultures consists of the parka, as well as pants that are worn by both male and females. Both of these are all made of skins and furs and consist of many layers of skins and furs. Of course, they're acquiring these skins and furs from other animals who are adapted to the Arctic environment, so they're staying incredibly warm. And what's also very important to Arctic groups is this fur hood right here. So you will often see this traditional, very large, very fluffy fur hood being worn by Native American cultures in the Arctic. And what's amazing is how much heat it actually just conserves and holds right in front of your face. So it's very strategic, this really beautiful hood and collar that Arctic groups often wear. And then, of course, mucklucks. These are the boots to protect your feet from the cold. So these are the traditional mucklucks made out of sealskin. You can also find fur mucklucks. They're very popular on the Western market. But traditionally, this was one of the most important pieces of the wardrobe, how to protect your feet in the snow. Here you have some Inuit women and children modeling the parka. Of course, the best way to keep your children warm is to keep them close to your skin. So usually a mother's parka differed in size from other people's parka so that they could also fit their children in with them and wear them on their backs. Now, when we talk about religion, a nice overgenerality of Arctic populations' common religion is a form of shamanism. Shamanism is interaction between a practitioner and the spirit world. Now, this interaction is that which is not available to other members of the community. So only the shaman is powerful enough or worthy enough or has an ability to actually communicate with the spirit world. And he does this on behalf of the community. So you will see shamans constantly throughout Native American art, material culture, as well as still being prominent components to their religion today, especially prominent figures in cultural characteristics. What's very interesting about Arctic cultures is that these were some of the latest North American cultures to continue to practice their traditional life ways. So many groups were still practicing their traditional life ways up until the 1940s, right after World War II. Because what happened is you've got quite a few people or quite a few military outposts that became built in Alaska to keep an eye on what was happening across the Pacific during World War II. And these army bases, Air Force bases, provided employment and resources to Native American groups. So Native American groups also started to settle around these sources of economic stability, you could say. So people were leaving their traditional homelands and their traditional settlements and forming communities around these military installations. As a result, you start to see a drop off in cultural traditions. Of course, these native groups have some of the strongest ties to their traditions, which is heartening. But as a result of this movement away from tradition, you do see that these modern native communities are facing many problems. The first of which not least, of course, is climate change. This is images from the Inuit village of Shishmaref on the westernmost point of the Seward Peninsula in northwest Alaska. And this community is actually losing its coastline to the point that the community structures are falling into the Bering Sea. And so one thing that they're doing is relocating the entire village, relocating the entire community to another region or to another place. And now think about what this is going to do culturally to the area. Think about how much cultural association is tied to the landscape in which a culture has lived and been evolving for hundreds of years. And so in a situation where as far as people that I've talked to in this community who who attest that nobody left in the entire village remembers how to build an umiak or a kayak. Why do you need to when you can get a hold of a motorboat? And now to be displaced or have to move from your entire homeland just gives you a glimpse of how much of their cultural tradition they're going to lose, right, over the next so many years of this transition and as they become more and more settled into their new residence. Of course, alcoholism is a problem that plagues all Native American groups and definitely plagues Native Alaskan groups in the Arctic. Later in the semester, we'll talk about how alcoholism is actually a genetic intolerance to alcohol, something that the Irish also share. So it's something that has been a problem in Native American groups ever since its introduction by Europeans and was very much used as a tool by these European colonizers to pacify Native American groups because it became quite apparent that they were not able to tolerate these kinds of toxins in their body and could definitely take advantage of Native American groups that succumbed to problems with alcoholism. And then another problem that's facing, again, all Native American groups today is the introduction of non traditional foods in their diet. So, when we talk about the development of this variation in culture, right along with that, of course, is the passing on and the isolation of the pretty much the genetic molecular ability of your body to metabolize certain foods. So Native American groups have been adapting to a certain diet for thousands of years. And it isn't until very recently, with modern Western populations, that they've had access to processed foods, to foods that are from other cultures, foods that probably we're all killing ourselves with HMOs and other aspects of what's natural and what's not. The high sugar content is a problem, and so it's causing rampant nutritional issues in all Native American groups, as well as the Arctic, of course, such as diabetes. And it all comes down to an inability of your body to metabolize certain chemicals. It's very similar to um, a dairy intolerance, lactose intolerance. Of course, many people can handle lactose, and usually the people that can are descendants of Western European, even Northern European groups that have had a tradition of dairy products in their culture, as far as the continuation of drinking milk past being an infant and a child. And so you start drinking cow's milk, the tradition of making cheese and other dairy products that have allowed these people to, over centuries and centuries, adapt to continue to have lactose in their diet and genetically still produce the enzymes necessary to process dairy in their gut. Whereas quite often in the rest of the world, African populations specifically, definitely Native American populations that have not grown up or have this tradition of dairy product in their diet. They do not milk cows and other animals that provide milk. And once you're no longer an infant, you never ingest dairy. You just don't have the genetic capability to metabolize lactose. So that's kind of an example of what non-traditional foods can do to groups who are used to and adapted to a certain diet, certain staples in their nutritional consortium. So that's all I have for you today, everybody. I will see you guys on Thursday, and we'll look at some ethnography and really get an idea for exactly what aspects of these generalities we can see in the cultural groups in the Arctic. Thank you so much for your attention. I will see you guys on Thursday. Today's Tuesday. I will see you guys on Thursday, and I'll definitely be able to make this PowerPoint available to you if I have rushed through any slides. Unfortunately, I can't see everyone to make sure that you have all got the notes down before I've moved on to the next slide. So please let me know if I can share this with you again, and I look forward to seeing y'all on Thursday.